Welcome to Flashback, a podcast by the Okaloosa County Public Information Office. Get ready to dust the nostalgia off your sleeve as we talk with Okaloosa citizens who share with us how things used to be. I'm your host, Nick Tomachek. It's time to step into your imaginary DeLorean, tap your flux capacitor, and flash back.
It's almost impossible to imagine what Okaloosa County would look like without hotels and other lodging establishments. Heck, even our neighborhood single-family style homes and apartments are being used for short-term vacation rentals. I'll be walking the dog one morning in my typical suburban-style neighborhood and see sunburned vacationers with out-of-state plates packing their truck beds with multiple tents and coolers, and that inflatable red rowboat fit for 1.5 people that they just had to get at the t-shirt store on Okaloosa Island. Or in recent years, a giant inflatable unicorn or flamingo. The advent of companies like Airbnb and VRBO have essentially made every town in the country a vacation spot in some way. Because from my point of view, every town has something interesting about it, and we're staying a couple days to learn about the area, its customs, and people. I was recently one of those vacationers staying at a short-term rental, but instead of Florida, I brought my flip-flop clad feet and pink shorts up to a small town in the great state of Wisconsin. I had never been there before. My preconceived notions about what that would be like and how uninteresting I thought it might be were totally wrong. Well, except for the massive cheese culture that you might expect from a place where people wear cheese-shaped hats at sporting events. But the house we rented was incredible. It was very normal in most ways, but being able to stay in a nice place and make your temporary home is still a novelty I enjoy. Today on Flashback, I want you to imagine this town, our county, with only 2 or 3 hotels or inns. Dirt roads abound. A commercial airport has not yet been created. The railroad in the county is still relatively new, and the only way to get to Okaloosa County by land is by rail. No bridges have been built, and places like Destin are minor blips on a map, let alone the consciousness of would-be vacationers. In fact, vacationing in Okaloosa County isn't even a thing. Imagine that. Mail was delivered by boat, and yes, people would come by boat if not by rail. This is a story about the early days of tourism in our county, centered around a vacation rental dating back to the 1920s that is no longer with us today. The Valparaiso Inn. The story of the inn cannot be told without telling a bit of its history, the history of the Vale of Paradise, aka the city of Valparaiso. Early land purchasing and land developed can be traced back to a man named Robert E. Lee McCaskill. We explored Valp in a previous episode about the airport, VPS, otherwise known as Destin Fort Walton Beach Airport. Here's an excerpt from that episode that gives a general sense of the early history of the city and how it was a popular vacation spot in the early to mid 20th century. McCaskill grew up in Walton County. About the time the Civil War was going on, he worked on a farm, and he and his family struggled financially like many in the South and the North after the war. He worked hard on the farm, but later set out to invest in the timber industry, then later a sawmill. He used whatever he had to start acquiring land. He even sold his lumber company at one point. He set up a hotel in Freeport, and he acquired most of the land in the Niceville, Valparaiso area. Now here's a guy who had the vision of how profitable real estate could be. He began advertising land opportunities in the Chicago Tribune. Here's an ad from the October 1917 edition of the Chicago Tribune where one of his ads was featured.
Valparaiso, the Vale of Paradise, 18 miles south of Crestview in Okaloosa County, the closest point to a railway of any location on beautiful Choctawhatchee Bay. Good roads being made for automobiles all the way. Launch connection with Pensacola, the metropolis of West Florida, within sound of the booming waves of the great warm Gulf of Mexico. Fishing, hunting, and rest for the weary nerves and tired mind and brain. Where to live is a pleasure and where life is prolonged. Good hotel accommodations for the tourists. I invite you, Bob McCaskill. Their prospects were toward the south. These words are as true today as in Bible times. The people of the North are weary of cold winters and hot summers and long for a land where the balmy breezes blow year-round, where there is no snow, no sleet, no cold rains, where winter is like May and June in the North Country.
Wow, that's quite an ad. Kind of biblical almost. And the ad worked. People from Chicago began coming down to the area and interest spread. James Ellsworth Plew, he was a mover and shaker too. He moved here from Chicago. And he is considered one of the early developers of Valp. And he created what was known as the Valparaiso Inn. It's a Spanish-styled accommodation. Newspaper articles describe this as a haven for retired businessmen. Plew himself was a successful businessman. He had success with a towel rental business for hospitals that became huge in the Midwest. He developed the Plew bicycle seat. He was also an early used car dealer and an avid airplane enthusiast. He was one of the first passengers on the Wright brothers airplane. He owned the first airplane in Chicago also before the year 1910. He acquired that 17,000 acres, now known as Niceville and Valp, in 1922, and he built the inn in 24. The inn was featured in the film 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, which tells the story of the famed Doolittle Raiders, who trained at Eglin Airfield. In fact, General Doolittle stayed at the inn during their training. Plew died in 1938, and according to his wishes, his ashes were strewn from an airplane over the water, not far from his old inn. Now, I want to mention that the Valparaiso Inn wasn't the only hotel in the area. The Bayshore Inn was also on the water and nearby, and from what I understand and the photos I saw, looked much smaller. So I don't want you to think that Valparaiso Inn was the only dog in the fight, but it certainly held a certain kind of status for those who stayed there, at least according to marketing materials and newspaper articles. I found an excerpt from the foreword of the Chamber of Commerce booklet that quotes James Plew and how he chose Valparaiso. I'll read it in my best James Plew Chicago voice. Valparaiso is the most ideal spot I have found in which to build a home. For 30 years I lived in Chicago. That is long enough. Always, in any city, there is the dirt, the noise, the scramble, the too close huddling of people indoors and out. And what does it amount to? A little more money earned, a lot more money spent. A number of years ago, like many other city dweller, I began to see in my mind's eye the garden spot that one day would be mine. Later, I went in search of it. Winter after winter, I traveled the South over. I found beautiful and enjoyable places, but never a spot that, to my way of thinking, entirely appealed to me. Then last February, by chance, I came to Valparaiso, my problem solved. Here, in the pines of Valparaiso, overlooking the Choctawhatchee Bay, I shall build the home I have always wanted, but could never find. I had a recent conversation with Ken Walsh, who's a trustee with the Heritage Museum of Northwest Florida, located in the original downtown Valparaiso. He also played the character of James Plew in a recent theatrical production that the museum held for fundraising efforts. Here is Ken filling in some other details about Plew and the city of Valparaiso and the inn.
You know, we're sitting here at the Heritage Museum in Valparaiso on Westview Avenue, which used to be the main drag.
Yeah.
Not hard to believe. But back in the day, over 100 years ago, and what we do at the museum is try to show visitors, new military families, and public school kids and homeschool children where we have classes about how did people survive before there was an Air Force base around here. And there is significant history to Okaloosa County itself long before even 100 years ago, going back to prehistoric eras and then the Spanish influence and the English influence. There wasn't a lot of stuff to do for people around here after the Civil War because the area was so remote. There were no trains and very few roads. What roads there were are like the ones that are still out there on the Eglin Reservation today. But that started to change, and then this whole area was part of the National Forest. Mm-hmm. and people hear about Camp Pinchot on Garnier's Bayou. Well, that was the headquarters, named after Gifford Pinchot, the first head of the National Forest Service, U.S. Forest Service. But there were two gentlemen who really changed this whole area. And I used to say on the radio, they were the guys who were responsible for creating snowbirds as we know them. And the first one was John Perrine from Chicago. And he was a guy with money. And he came down here in the turn of the century, the previous century, and so loved the area that he decided to stay and created Valparaiso Development Company. He then, later on, just before he died, he was able to incorporate the city and have it, the city of Valparaiso, and have it recognized by the state of Florida. But another gentleman who had come along after him, also from Chicago, was James Plew. But Mr. Plew was a very effective businessman, and he arrived around 100 years ago. When the Valparaiso Development Company went bust, he bought that up and created the Valparaiso Realty, and did the same thing that Perrine had intended to do, and that was to say all this area that wasn't controlled by the U.S. government and the Forest Service, all the areas around the bayous and the bay, and promote tourism, bring people down from Chicago. Perrine had actually started the express trains from Chicago down to Crestview when they finally had railroad access. But Plew expanded that greatly. And in order to convince the people with the money to come down and spend the winters, and besides selling the lots, he built the golf course.
Eglin Golf Course.
Which is now the one on Eglin Air Force Base, one that you pass as you drive through Niceville. The original hotel had very beautiful, they had individual bathrooms, 2-bedroom suites, a dining area, and a big, open area, an outdoor, as you can see, an outdoor porch looking out across the bay. Mm-hmm. You could see all the way to Destin from that view. It was kind of a curved, just a beautiful location.
The inn was constructed for $250,000 and became a hub for business and social affairs. Originally, the first floor, one with whole wings, was for dining and dancing. Ironically, Plew, to make his guests feel safe and to keep insurance rates low, ran a water pipe from a water tank deep in Valpo directly to the inn for the exclusive use of the inn in case of a fire. It had 67 guest rooms, a breakfast bar, elegant dining room, and looking at an old photo that is on file at the Heritage Museum, I could see the inside first floor. It shows a baby grand piano, a nicely cushioned chair, and a seating area with a large fireplace. The outside of the hotel and the entire hotel design was based off of a hotel that Plew knew from Chicago, the Edgewater Beach Hotel. It had Spanish-styled archways and 4 distinct wings laid out like a cross, the idea being that as the wind would come off of the bayou and bay, it would circulate properly through the building to keep guests cool. The Valparaiso Inn never had AC. The closest thing I could compare it to that still exists is the Lodge at Wakulla Springs. It's got that deep old Florida vibe, closely influenced by transplants like Plew, giving it a more luxurious feel. Now let's go back to Ken.
And people don't realize that when the Depression hit, it was Mr. Plew who said, we got to do something, because people didn't have the money to come down and buy lots at that time. Mm-hmm. People needed jobs around here. He was the one who went up to Montgomery, Alabama, and convinced the Army to come down here and he actually built the Valparaiso Airport.
Plew did.
James Plew built the 2 runways that we still have now. And the Army pilots, believe it or not, they were somewhat familiar with the area. And then he built the runways, and they came down there and saw it and said, yeah, this is exactly what we're looking for as a bombing and gunnery range. And that was when the transfer of the property from the Forest Service to the military took place in the Depression era in the mid-30s. But then they acquired control over the forest land from the Forest Service.
Okay.
And that's what we know as the 442 square miles of Eglin Air Force Base, and why it's the biggest Air Force base in the country.
Oh.
So that by the time the World War II started and the Doolittle Raiders arrived in the early days of 1942, while they trained up at Duke Field, they stayed at the Valparaiso Inn, and so did many of the other personnel who were coming in and getting settled, and then they were building houses over in Shalimar and stuff like that. Plew's dream, became a reality, but I still blame Perrine and Plew for, all these snowbirds, all the Yankees like me from New Jersey who live here, or the many people who come down here. But this was one of the first places where the tourists stayed, and that's the really historic significance of the Valparaiso Inn. There are some rumors that I've heard living here about certain people who came down here,
I will say for the record,
from Chicago, who are well known.
Hey, I have found no evidence of that yet, though. Yes, the rumors do fly. Al Capone, boy, just about every other episode I do, the subject of Al Capone and his gang hanging out in Okaloosa County comes up. According to Mrs. Ruckle from a Playground Daily News article, it says, quote, "These rumors are completely false. He was never in Valparaiso or the surrounding area." I tend to agree with her. If you find any evidence of Mr. Capone in our area, you let me know. But I have yet to find it, and I'm not gonna say he was definitely here. But we have an article, October 14th, 1980. Valparaiso Inn demolition mold by commissioners. And then 12 days later, it burns down. And in the 12 days later story from the Playground Daily News, very suspicious fire raged through the Valparaiso Inn, leveling the 56-year-old landmark.
And it was, it was a tragedy because it was such a beautiful structure and a beautiful location right there on the point, right around the bend there in the bayou, and just a historical view, and it would be a place that people would love to stay at if it were still in existence. But it's very ironic. They could rent a room, stay for a week for $25 to $30 a week back in the day.
Wow. $24 a night? I'll take it. Thanks to Ken for that insight. The marketing strategy to get people to the inn was genius. The Valparaiso Development Company would send postcards depicting the water and people enjoying the inn, and then send them to people outside of the area with notes written that said, for example, "These people make you feel at home right off. This place is even better than I thought it would be. I like it here." Imagine getting a random postcard with something like that. It might work. The demise of the Valparaiso Inn, and unfortunately and bizarrely like many other businesses in Northwest Florida, involves fire. In fact, the Valparaiso Inn suffered 3 total fires, 2 of which were very serious. The one in 1980 finishing it off. We need to do a quick timeline recap of the Valparaiso Inn. So in 1924, it was built by James Plew. Plew passed away in 1938. A 1949 article has M.O. Carpenter as a manager and sublessee, promising to improve the inn and modernize it. The article also notes that it sits on a lot around Lake Choctawhatchee. Kind of neat. Lonnie Harrell purchased the inn in 1950 from the late C.W. Ruckle Sr., Plew's son-in-law, and then operated it as a hotel until '57, and then converted it into apartments. In 1965, the inn ran into financial troubles and was sold at an auction purchased by a Pensacola Savings and Loan Company. Then, in 1977, the owner, Byron Beeler, tried to get the inn on the National Historic Register to acquire funding to renovate it. In June 1980, an article noted that it had received a niche on the National Historic Register of Historic Places in 1978, but still the building sat vacant. Beeler then traded the site to Ernest and Marilyn Taylor of Grass Valley, California, in exchange for a San Diego parcel in 1979. I guess he really didn't want that inn anymore. Marilyn Taylor tried to get it rezoned to commercial to allow for tax incentives. And then in 1980, curiously, the city tried to work with the Taylors, who were having marital troubles, by giving them some extra time to work out what to do with the property. 12 days after the city commission meeting, the inn was set ablaze and arson was suspected. 1981, the city hired a crew to remove the rubble from the site, promising to put a lien on the property if the Taylors do not pay the city back for the debris removal. The present-day townhomes were built and sold. I found the earliest property appraiser record I have found was indicating a sale in 1983. I had the opportunity to speak with one of the residents who lived across the street from the inn in the 1970s, Bob Batchelor, whose wife Charlotte used to hang out with the residents of the inn from time to time and enjoy the airy porch of the inn. He had an interesting perspective on the final days of the inn. Here's Bob.
So what do you know about the Valparaiso Inn?
When I was stationed here in 1975 to the test wing as a flight test engineer, and we ended up buying 1189 Bayshore Drive, which is catty corner across the street from the inn.
I see it, yeah.
You see that 1189?
Yeah, I'm looking on the map, yeah.
Right, okay, so that was our house. It was built in 1948, and we lived there for the 3 years that we were here. And Charlotte made a lot of friends over there at the inn. She would go over there sometimes in the afternoon or mornings, I guess, and sit on the deck that overlooked Boggy Bayou.
Who were the people at the inn at the time? What types of folks were staying there? There were
servicemen staying there and their wives. So the 1 or 2 bedroom apartments. I'm not really sure which. And I know there was one family that Charlotte visited with. Sadly, the lady was pregnant and fell off her bike and lost the baby at something like 8 months. It was terrible, absolutely terrible. But she would go over there sometimes in the afternoon and sit with the people that were there. Most of them were retirees, I think. I personally don't know, other than I know there were a few GIs there, airmen, and older people. And she would sit on that back deck with them and just visit and, chat and have a nice view, and that was it. That's what she did. And then one day at 10 o'clock in the morning, she called me, and she said, "The inn is on fire." And I said to her, "Which way is the wind blowing?" And she said, "Right at us." Mm. And I said, "Oh, God." I said, "Turn the hose on, get the roof as wet as you can. I'll be home right away." And so, fortunately, our house did not burn up, of course, but the inn was no longer inhabitable. The Air Force came, and NICEL came, and Valpe came, and squirted water on it and everything, and it looked like it was under control for me and almost out, so I went back to work. And she and this girlfriend that I was telling you about, they were sitting in our lawn, and they all left. And Charlotte looked over there, and she said, "It's not out." Mm. She said, "I can still see some smoke starting to rise." And sure enough, they had to come back. And that's when it became uninhabitable, because now this fire spread more worse. And boom, that was it. So a little while later, the owner, whose name I forget, let all the employees take whatever they wanted and let them come in and take whatever was left that they wanted. And so they did. And then he opened it up to the public to take whatever they wanted. And then we got stationed in UK. And it was a Saturday, and a friend who lived here said, I want to tell you, your little house is still standing. And I said, why are you calling and telling me that?
Oh.
He said, because last night the inn burned to the ground. They let it burn to the ground. And I said, what direction was the wind blowing? And he said, from the north.
Okay.
I said, oh, they set the fire so that all the ashes and everything would blow out over the bay.
What do you mean? What do you mean, Bob? That they? Who's they?
Don't know.
Okay.
But that's my opinion.
Yeah.
That's my guess, because there was nobody living there. There was no power. There was no gas. Everything was all cut off. So how could it catch fire again?
I know. Well, even the news articles I was reading about it clearly stated burned to the ground under suspicious circumstances.
Exactly.
And I think that was a quote from the state fire marshal, too. So. Yeah.
There's no doubt in my mind about it at all. They waited until the wind was at the right direction, and they waited long enough that, they could get away with it, whoever they was. And that's what they did. And then, unfortunately, the townhomes were all built there, and our view went to heck in a handbasket. Because when we would sit there, when the inn was there, we would sit in the morning on Saturday mornings and have our morning coffee and we had a direct view of the bayou, because that's where the tennis courts were.
Okay.
So we just loved that place. And we still own it, by the way. If you do your research, we still own the property, but the house is gone. So that's as much as I know about the inn. I wanted to buy it. I tried to talk my dad into buying it after the first fire.
Yeah.
I said, Dad, we could fix this up and reinstate it as to the way that it was back, in the 30s and 40s. The inn has the original chandelier that was in there in the dancing area. And, it would have been something, could have turned that thing, would have been a money grab and a big boon for Valparaiso, but Dad didn't want any part of it. He said, nope, not doing that. I said, okay.
Yeah, that would have been a pretty big endeavor, but
it would have been. But now I was told that the floor, which was all, I don't know if it was red oak, but I know that it was oak. I was told that the floor was all cut and fully assembled in the Northeast somewhere, and each board was floorboard. Now we're talking about the finished floorboards was numbered in a sequential order, taken apart, put on a barge, and floated down here and reassembled. Yeah, and Plew was one for detail, and his final home is at the corner of Eastview and North Bay Shore Drive.
Okay, so he wasn't staying at the inn. He had a separate house?
He had a house, correct. Okay. And it's still standing. It's still there.
I found an article from the Playground Daily News that reports on the details that were known immediately following the 1980 fire. This article was written by Jim Schaffner, and on one excerpt from it says, Investigator Otterback said he visited the scene Saturday, but found the debris too hot to examine closely. As for a cause, he said, quote, I've been told that some of the, younger set used the place as a party place. That's the way I'm looking at it now, end quote. The article goes on and says he said he did not know when his investigation would be completed. Valparaiso City Clerk Bill Kendall said late Saturday the building's owners had not been notified of the fire. He said he had tried but failed to contact them. Mayor Bruce Arnold said the future use of the land on which the inn stood would be determined by the owners. The fire was called in by Caroline Ransom, who lives on Bayshore Drive opposite the inn. She said she was awakened by a boy knocking on the door sometime after 3 and could see that the middle section was in flames. Valparaiso Police Chief Lomax Donaldson said his department wants to locate and question 3 guys who are believed to have been the first to see the fire. The word Inn, which stood in foot-tall letters on the arched entrance to the building, was salvaged Saturday afternoon and donated to the Historical Society of Okaloosa and Walton counties. Some later articles seem to have placed the blame on the final fire on a few kids that may have been seen in the area, possibly one of them notifying the neighbor to call 911. Don't know. Items that remained after the fire were either sold or given away. Some of the items Bob Batchelor donated to the Heritage Museum, and Tom Rice, owner of the Magnolia Grill, also has some of the original light fixtures on the top floor of his restaurant in Fort Walton Beach, which also serves as a kind of museum with artifacts collected over time related to the county. Time has a way of changing things, sometimes without you knowing it. Buildings are just buildings, but the memories made in them are what is important. The people that were there, the stories told and remembered is what is important. The story of the Valparaiso Inn is another example of a building that was part of our past in Okaloosa County and should be recognized for its importance in shaping a foundation of commerce, tourism, and old Florida living, no matter how you feel that effort evolved over time. Knowing our history helps us understand our present and creates perspective as we plan for the future. I want to thank Bob Batchelor, Ken Walsh, and Jerry Ann Chancellor, and the hospitality of the folks at the Heritage Museum of Northwest Florida, located in the Vale of Paradise. This episode was written and edited by me. Our theme music is composed by Jason Shaw on Audionautics.com. Thanks for listening. I'll see you around town.